Hello, everybody. We're still rolling in. I'm Monica Rondazzo. I'm with Hennepin County. Welcome, everyone, to the Hennepin County Learning Series on tree selection and best planting practices. We've got Dan Jertson and Ryan Murphy here, both from the University of Minnesota Urban Forestry Outreach and Research Lab. They have tons of knowledge and wisdom and great stories to share with all of us. So, very excited that they're here. We have our next learning series coming up in person a month away on June 20th. That'll be at Falwell Park Tree Identification, and we'll be running around outside. But let's just start off right away. Ryan and Dan, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Monica. And happy Thursday, summer Thursday evening to everyone. It's a beautiful day out there today. I spent most of the time in our nursery, actually, working on some trees. So good day to talk about tree selection and best planting practices. So I'll just start it off here by kind of laying out the roadmap. I'm going to start by talking about tree selection for the first half, and then I'll pass the baton over to Ryan, who's going to cover best planting practices. So within my talk, I'm going to be covering our updated plant hardiness zone map. So in 2023, there is an update. The previous map was from 2012, so there's been some changes because of our changing climate, and that's represented in the map that I'll cover. And after we talk about plant hardiness zone, then I'll go into tree selection. And the tree selection is kind of based on the urban environment that we're asking these trees to grow in, and also how our climate is changing and what tree species we might be able to expect to grow now in Minnesota that our plant hardiness zone has changed in certain areas. All right, so for those of you who aren't familiar with plant hardiness zone, it's a numbered system that breaks down the average annual extreme winter temperature in 10-degree increments. And 1 is the coldest, and it goes up till 10 on this scale from this slide that you can see. And each zone also is broken down into like subzones, and it's not listed here, but each one would have an A and a B. A being the colder of that zone, and then B being the warmer part. So for instance, if you look at 3, it goes from -40 to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. So 3A would be -40 to -35, and then 3B would be -35 to -30. So that's how it's broken down halfway in that 10 degree increment. And so within the state of Minnesota, we have zone 3A in the far north, and then now we get all the way down to or up to 5A around the metro area and southern Minnesota. So this is the whole United States and the current hardiness zone map. And now we'll zoom in, and here's Minnesota. So on the left in this slide, you can see 2012 plant hardiness zone map. And unfortunately, it's a little bit harder to read because they use white font and outline the counties in white. But if you compare to the map on the right, which is the updated 2023, some key differences are that 3A has receded north. So if people can see my cursor, we've got a 3A just north of Grand Falls here, and then within St. Louis County, there's a 3A zone. But if you look previously, like all of this around the Canadian border was 3A, and it is no longer considered 3A in that area. Another big difference, the expansion of 4A into that 3B zone. So that's a lot bigger now in the northern part of Minnesota. And then I'll also highlight, so now you can see this big zone around the metro, what I'm calling like the heat island. We have a lot of impervious surfaces that heat up the area around the Twin Cities. So we have 5A now around the metro, as well as a good portion of the southern part of Minnesota as well. So that leads on to, well, here, sorry, I'll blow it up. Now you can see that 5A around the metro. And then, yeah, around the southern part of the state, how it's changed. So there's some current research going on here in our department, the Department of Forest Resources, and in collaboration with other partners like the U.S. Forest Service on adaptive silviculture, or like what tree species we can expect to be growing, in this case, in a forested setting where emerald ash borer has taken out all of the ash trees. And now there's this big question mark of like what will be regenerating in this area. And there's a lot of invasive species, unfortunately, that are kind of taking that niche. So part of this research is to find out what tree species might do better now that we have this changing climate. And that this is the topic that is kind of like discovering what tree species we can bring up from slightly further south up into Minnesota, those zone 5A, maybe 5B trees, such as, you know, I've listed tulip poplar here and American sycamore. So this is something to stay tuned on, and it's not the only research project working on this, but in years to come, it'll be interesting to see what tree species are doing well compared to others. All right, so we've talked about the changing climate in Minnesota. Our hardiness zones are changing as we're experiencing more warmth. But I'd like to stress the importance of site assessment to inform proper tree selection. So not really considering climate change, it's really important to figure out what the specifics of the site where you're asking a tree to grow are. So for instance, soil texture and pH are important things to know. So you can take a soil test, which it's very easy. Here at the university and the St. Paul campus, we have a soil testing lab where you can drop off a sample and for right around $20, assess your soils to figure out what the texture is, what the pH is, what the organic matter content is, and then some nutrient information like phosphorus and potassium. So that's really, really helpful information to know when you're selecting what tree to plant at a site. And beyond that, like sun and shade, so what's the exposure? You know, is it on the north side of the building where you're trying to grow a tree? Potentially, you know, that might inform certain tree species that like to have their roots in the shade, because on the north side of the building, the roots will be shaded, as opposed to the south side where it's going to be exposed to the sun all day long. And if the soil is warmed up, certain tree species might not do as well. Wind exposure is big, especially in the wintertime. So if we're thinking about growing marginally hardy species or like zone 5 species, planting the tree on the northwest side of the house, that tree will be exposed to the prevailing winds in the wintertime. Soil moisture availability. So are the soils more clay or like a clay loam, or are the soils on the other end of the spectrum where they're more sandy loams or sand? So the moisture availability will be different. Clay soils tend to hold on to moisture longer, especially a clay loam and like silt loam. Those are like more ideal soils for nutrient availability as well as water retention. Then you get into sandy soils and the water is going to drain out more quickly. So water will not be as available with sandy soils. And then beyond those characteristics of soil, it's important to think about what the urban environment does to our soils. So, spreading salt in the wintertime can impact soils next to impervious surfaces such as driveways, sidewalks, roads. So the soil around those areas can have salt in them. Low organic matter is really common because typically during development, the topsoil is taken away, unfortunately, and grading happens, and what's brought back is not nearly the same as what was there beforehand, meaning that the topsoil that comes back is not as adequate, and there's less organic matter on the site now. Compacted soil is really common from development, foot traffic, mowing, all these things that we do around our buildings. And then impermeable surfaces, like I mentioned, driveways, sidewalks, roadways, they all take in heat, so they're affecting the environment around those surfaces. So now I want to break down two different categories of trees within the urban environment. So I think about trees as either municipal trees, meaning they're boulevard, they're parks, so they're public trees, and then we have residential trees. So municipal trees, and I'm kind of making generalizations here, but typically they have more limitations because there are more stressors, meaning there's lower soil volume in a boulevard as opposed to someone's front yard or backyard. Because there are so many public trees, typically they don't get as much care because there are thousands of trees and there are only so many municipal workers to take care of those trees. There's less potential for those trees to reach maturity because of all these stressors. So, ecosystem services aren't, greatest because the trees aren't getting to maturity. Not to say it, some of them most certainly do. I'm just talking about the limitations here. Only a certain number of tree species can tolerate boulevard planting sites. So diversity is hard to, getting a little feedback, sorry. It's hard to get a lot of diversity in this planting. And then interference with infrastructure is always a challenge with, traffic and utilities and signage. We have to make sure that we can move amongst these trees safely. But within the public realm, I think that park trees are probably like the most diverse, or opportunity for most diverse trees to grow in, since there's less disturbance and stressors. And then here's the flip side. Now we're talking about residential trees. So private properties, people planting trees in their yards. And there's a more of a chance for, or a higher species potential because there's less stressors in this setting. There's a lot of rooting space available, typically, less disturbance, potential for more care depending on the landowner or the homeowner. meaning that the trees might reach maturity more likely. But there are also limitations. So what is the property owner's interest for caring for the trees? Income is most certainly a factor. Smaller lots, yeah, that can be a limiting factor. Cultural values and preferences of a resident. And I mentioned this last one, newer construction sites. It's kind of like, it's unfortunate that like the efficiencies of putting up new developments like really alter the site, meaning like all the trees are removed and all these houses go up, and the landscape is highly impacted or negatively impacted. So it's a real challenge to ask trees to then grow in these certain circumstances. All right, so I broke down the public versus private, and now we're getting into the tree selection. So I'm starting off with a slide of tree species that are not recommended for planting, or at least like different genera also of trees that are not recommended. And I'll start with the two top ones, amber maple and Norway maple. These two tree species are known to naturalize in our natural resource settings, meaning that they seed into these settings and they're displacing native plants. So they're becoming a problem in our ecosystems. Calorie pear is also recognized to be an issue, and it's part of a phase out. So in 2026, you'll no longer be able to buy this tree in the nursery trade. Of course, emerald ash borer is impacting our ash canopy, so it's not recommended to be planting any ash trees out in the landscape anymore. I mentioned maples because there are kind of an overrepresentation of maples in the urban forest currently. Also, there's a lot of pruning or structural issues with some of our hybrid maples. So they're more prone to break apart in storms, meaning you just have to start over with a new tree. So it's best off choosing a different species of tree that's more suitable for longevity and adding more diversity to our urban forest. Another tree that's under assessment started in 2021 is Japanese tree lilac, and that tree is known to produce a lot of seed and then potentially grow in natural resource areas. And that's the seed pods here in the photograph on the right of Japanese tree lilac, that is. All right, so this slide covers some small tree considerations, and what I mean by small tree is a mature height of 20 to 25 feet. So you can think of this tree as like a backyard patio, like right alongside the patio, or you may have some overhead power lines or utilities coming into your house. This would be a more suitable tree to plant adjacent to those lines. The first one I do mention is a striped maple, which I know I just mentioned maples in the urban forests, are overrepresented, but this is one option that there are not, I can't really think of many at all that I've seen in the urban forest, and would be a great understory tree or complement to a small backyard setting. Another one, autumn brilliant serviceberry. So there are many different service berries available out there. I highlight this one because of its fall color and then its ability to produce larger fruit, which are edible and also attract birds and wildlife to the yard. Another one, which is showcased in this photograph here, Blue Beech. It's a beautiful understory tree native to the state of Minnesota, has gorgeous fall color. And it's a very slow growing tree, but slow growing is not necessarily a bad thing. It's lower maintenance because it grows slowly. It doesn't need much pruning maintenance, and it's long lived, which is also a good thing. Eastern redbud, beautiful in the springtime. There's a Minnesota hardy strain of redbud that is readily available at most nurseries that carry trees. Hawthorn, there are some thornless varieties available out there, but also it's just good to have different hawthorns that are also have thorns for wildlife habitat, and they have beautiful spring blooms as well. And another tree that's similar to blue beech is ironwood, another understory, native understory tree to Minnesota. Nice gold fall color, some cool exfoliating bark, kind of sloughs off in strips. So that's another slow growing, smaller tree that would be great for a smaller backyard or small front yard, or underneath some mature shade trees. And now we're moving on to some larger tree considerations. And I mentioned a fir right off the bat, and this is a good alternative to Colorado blue spruce in that it also has that bluish tinge to the needles. But this tree, white fir, doesn't have the needle pathogen that blue spruce, Colorado blue spruce has, which is Rhizosphaera. It's a fungal pathogen that ends up killing off a lot of the foliage low in the tree so that you have dead branches low in the canopy. And for an evergreen or a conifer, it kind of interrupts the natural growth habit where you want that nice pyramidal shape where the low limbs are out wider, and then as you get to the top, it forms up into a narrow growth at the top. So if half the growth at the bottom is dead, you've kind of interrupted that natural growth habit. So white fir is a good alternative to the Colorado blue spruce. I mentioned a bitternut hickory. It's another slow growing nut tree that has beautiful fall color. It's native to the state of Minnesota. It grows within the Big Woods complex, which is kind of like encompassing the metro area and off further west of the metro. Good for wildlife habitat as well. Northern catalpa is becoming more common in the urban forest as a street tree and park tree, and I've seen more planted in residential settings too. It's got beautiful orchid-like flowers that early summer they bloom, big heart-shaped leaves that kind of look almost tropical in a sense. It's a nice fast-growing tree. Kentucky coffee tree, just native to Minnesota in the southeast corner. It's got some cool platy bark and some nice fine textured foliage. Tamarack, so that's a deciduous gymnosperm or a cone-bearing tree that has needles, but the needles drop every fall and they turn this beautiful gold. So that's a nice option to have in the residential setting. Eastern white pine, the typical form of white pine is pretty stately, relatively fast growing. Kind of gives that North Woods vibe to a space. Another one that would complement that tree well is big-tooth aspen, and I don't see many big-tooth aspen in the residential setting at all. More quaking aspen, and big-tooth aspen I think is a better tree in the long run just because of the less canker or disease issues. and it's just got a different growth pattern to it than the quaking aspen does. Of course, bur oak is one of my favorite trees, and I'll always recommend, you know, a stately bur oak that's slow growing. It's very tolerant of a lot of different conditions, wet soils versus dry. So that's one of my go-tos always. And then I want to mention some American elms, some cultivars that is, that are out there that are Dutch elm disease resistant. And St. Croix is the first one. So that's a tree that was found in Afton, Minnesota to be naturally resistant to Dutch elm disease. And now it's readily available in the nursery trade. And it's got more of an open grown, like spreading canopy. So that can be a beautiful shade tree if it has enough space to spread out. And another option for American elm is Prairie Expedition. And that's a cultivar that I believe is from South Dakota. Another very urban tolerant American elm cultivar that is Dutch elm disease resistant. So now we're moving on to zone 5 species. I've got a list here, and I think most of these trees are on the list provided for the attendees of this talk from Hennepin County. And also I'll mention that you can go out to the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum and see a lot of these trees out in growing in the landscape. And many of them have been growing at the Arboretum for decades. So, you know, there are certain ones that have been growing in Minnesota for a while, even though they're considered zone 5 hardiness zone. So Dawn Redwood's the first one I got listed here. That's another deciduous gymnosperm or cone-bearing tree that drops its leaves in the wintertime, has beautiful fall color. Similar to the bald cypress, which is shown here in the photograph on the right. That's the fall color of a common bald cypress. Common sassafras, that's a tree that I'm familiar with from working at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum. It's got really cool, like mitten-shaped leaves. They tend to grow in stands, and the collection at the Arboretum in Madison, Wisconsin had a small stand of them that were between, 6 and 10 inches in diameter. So I wouldn't expect them to get very large in, the upper Midwest, but they're very cool tree with some interesting leaf texture to them. Then I have a number of oaks listed here. The post oak, chinkapin oak, which is just native to Minnesota, once again in the southeast corner. Shingle oak and scarlet oak. These are all oaks that you can see at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum and the Oak and Nut collection. I think I'll highlight chinkapin out of all 4 of these as a great tree to try in the urban environment where the conditions aren't ideal. And this tree, according to what I've read and seen in the landscape, it can tolerate some conditions that are probably categorized as more poor. And a couple others got listed here. Common hop tree, that's a smaller multi-stem tree with some interesting trifoliate, meaning the leaves have 3 parts to them. And the fruit are these little winged circular fruit that if you break them open and smell them, they smell a lot like citrus. So it's an interesting tree, small multi-stem tree. And then the pitch pine, which there's a beautiful specimen in the pine collection at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum that all along its limbs, the foliage grows from where the limb comes off the stem all the way to the end. So it's this very fuzzy looking pine. It grows quite large, similar to where the eastern white pine would be, maybe not quite that big. Another list of trees here, and some of them you can see in the shade tree exhibit at the Arboretum, including the black tupelo, which is the first one listed in the photograph on the right. Shows a black tupelo in fall color. Cucumber tree magnolia, that's a tree that I would recommend in more sensitive sites, so protected from winter winds and tends to have some access to some better soils, regular moisture. It's a little bit more sensitive. Tulip tree, gorgeous, large forest grown tree. So it grows real fast and the leaves kind of look like the outline of a cat's face. So it's got ears and little whiskers coming out the side. Silver bell, also in the shade tree exhibit, has some interesting bell-shaped flowers that form in the summertime. Multi-stemmed tree or large shrub. Common persimmon, this is something that I'm interested in seeing more of. I've grown one is growing out in Matamidi and has survived 3 winters and is growing pretty well. But the fruit, if we could get persimmon fruit in Minnesota, that would be pretty cool. But I've heard this tree, from what I've read and experienced in Wisconsin, that it's pretty urban tolerant. And then there's a number of hickories here. Hardy pecan, pignut hickory, shellbark hickory. I didn't put it on, but shagbark is another hickory. So these slow growing trees that have a lot of wildlife value to them would be important to be adding into our landscape. The hardy pecan at the Arboretum that was planted in the 80s has produced a lot of fruit or nuts in the last couple of summers, so that was fun to see. And then common pawpaw. This tree, a friend of mine is growing in his yard and had flowers on it last summer. So I'm anticipating seeing some fruit or trying some pawpaw fruit from his trees in the near future. I've got 3 of them growing in Matamidi along with the persimmon, and they're probably about 6 feet tall now. So I would imagine they'll start flowering soon. But pawpaw, the fruit, is described as texture of a banana and like flavor of a mango. So kind of this tropical fruit. So I want to mention, since we just talked about zone 5, hardiness zone 5 trees to be trying in Minnesota, but something that's worth considering is the provenance. And that means where in that tree's range those seeds or cuttings are coming from. And if you're trying to grow a zone 5 plant, it's well worth choosing plant material or seeds from that northernmost range, meaning that the temperatures that the trees in the northernmost range of that zone 5 plant are going to be more acclimated to our Minnesota, newly listed zone 5A areas, as opposed to taking a tree from down in Georgia, for instance, or source down from Georgia. So finding that northernmost reach of that tree species. And then through my own endeavors and just talking to others about zone 5 plants, this is a list of nurseries that carry zone 5A or just zone 5 tree species that you can order from. And a number of them are in the upper Midwest, or like Illinois, or just south of Wisconsin. And there's one listed out in Portland, Oregon, but that's One Green World, and that's where the pawpaws that I've ordered and my friend has grown in his yard for 5-6 years now. And some other resources about climate ready woodlands, the University of Minnesota Extension, climate change from the U.S. Forest Service. Then a couple of different resources. If you go to the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, they have a plant finder on their website. And once you go to that plant finder, you can do this on your phone. You can type in common name of that plant or scientific name if you know it, and hit enter, and it'll tell you where on the grounds that tree or those trees exist. So you can go and see them in the landscape. It's a very useful tool. And then some other resources that I use pretty regularly for plant selection. Michael Durr's Manual of Woody Landscape Plants is wonderful. Some interesting information, anecdotal and like kind of, I don't know, opinions from Michael Durr that can be comedic at times. This middle book, Native Trees, Shrubs, and Vines for Urban and Rural America. It's out of print from the 1990s, early 90s. So some of the plant nomenclature isn't correct anymore, but it's got a lot of useful information about urban conditions and what tree species will tolerate certain conditions such as, salt or drought and heat tolerance or air pollution. So that's a really good source. And then for native trees and shrubs of Minnesota, Welby Smith's book is beautiful photographs, great information, and just I don't know, a great book to have around. So yeah, that's my section on tree selection and how our climate is changing here in Minnesota. And I'm gonna pass it along to Ryan here, who's gonna cover the best planting practices.
Cool, thanks, Dan. The enjoyable talk to listen to. I started relaxing and just like, yeah, this is good. Dan won't tell you this, but or he's not one to brag, but he came in runner-up at the recent Minnesota Tree Climbing Championships. And so we'll be competing at nationals down in Texas in March. So go you for it. Yeah. Okay, best planting practices, and I haven't been able to look at the chat, so I don't know if there are any lingering questions, but maybe best just to keep moving through here and then hopefully have the ability to answer some questions at the end. So if thinking about planting, and now we've got all these new exciting trees to be planting in our yards and in our parks, and we now have some sources where to get it. We can talk about just some of the basics around what are we going to do so that we get these in the ground and keep them alive. So there's three basic nursery stock types or production methods. We've got bare root, container grown trees, as well as ball and burlapped. And each one of these nursery production methods are going to have positives and negatives associated with them. So going through here, bare root trees, oftentimes you'll get trees that are bare root and quite a bit smaller than these, but you can get larger calipered bare root trees. These are trees that are grown in a nursery field, production field, and then they're dug from the ground, usually in the fall, with the roots then being completely exposed, so no soil, and then stored in coolers, high humidity coolers over winter, and then shipped out in the springtime. Some of the advantages of working with bare root would be things like they're lightweight. You can get these trees at the cheapest cost. Because those roots are visible, you can correct any dysfunctional roots that might be going on. You can have really good species selection, especially if you're willing to ship trees to yourself. And then volunteer friendly. It's you can have a second grader carry a tree, and the other nursery stock types, that's probably not going to be the case. Some of the disadvantages when it comes to bare root trees would be that spring availability. They all are going to be coming to you at one point. You have to do something with them. You can't get the largest trees as bare root trees. So if you need something with immediate impact, bare root's not going to be probably your method. Some nurseries will have minimum orders. You can get just a couple few trees from certain growers, but a lot of the larger growers are going to require you to buy so many trees for them to ship to you. And then because those roots are exposed, they're very fragile and can dry out and die quite quickly. So we have to know what to do with them. Here's a shout out to Hennepin County. There's Dustin Ellis. They've have this, I think it's a nice, clever method for working with bare root trees because they're so fragile and easily drying out, and you have a large planting event. What they'll do is they'll take these large nursery containers and then put the bare root tree in there, cover it with wood mulch, and then water that wood mulch in. So now you've got those roots protected. You can bring it right to the planting site, and then the mulch is ready to go. Okay, second type, probably quite familiar to a lot of us, is just your standard container grown, plastic grown tree. And here we're showing two different types of containers, the classic smooth-sided container, as well as an air root pruning pot, which we'll come back to. So there are, again, advantages and disadvantages to container grown trees. Because they're growing in that media mixture in that soil, that nursery soil, they're going to be able to just have a longer season, or there's more flexibility for you because you can water that tree and keep it protected and healthy while it waits to find its permanent home. And so these are going to be more expensive than bare root trees. And so that's sort of an advantage or a disadvantage. Dry out less, right? So again, working with protected roots, still pretty good species selection from nurseries. Got a lot of roots. Immediately, especially if you start getting larger trees, these become very heavy, where now you might need two people to move these trees. And then dysfunctional roots are really the big problem with a lot of these potted trees, which we'll cover more in depth. And that just requires more training to plant these trees properly. So one of those issues, the encircling roots, you can see when the tree has grown, the roots have grown and hit the side of those smooth-sided containers. They sort of start growing in right along the edge. And at a certain point, the roots become mature enough or woody enough where they won't break out of this growth habit. And so you can see here an image of potentially like a white cedar that had been in the ground for a number of years and still was maintaining this highly encircling root system without a lot of good root exploration out into the soil. And then the final stock type, I don't know if I've ever heard anybody tell me that ball and burlap was their favorite nursery production method. See, you're working with hopefully a mechanized system. So we've got our skid loader here and our tree spade, which can go in and dig these root balls. They are very heavy, 300, 400 pounds. I don't know how, and you can see even larger ones. And in that regard, that is potentially one of their biggest advantages, is that if you need immediate impact from trees in your landscape, for example, you built a new football stadium, you're probably not going to be planting 2-year-old bare root whips. You're going to be planting some specialty grown ball and burlap type tree spaded tree. They also, again, have a lot of similar advantages to container grown in that those roots are protected. And in our research that we've done through the U4 lab, Monica collected a bunch of data for it actually, is that these trees have the best 1-year survival out of all the nursery production methods, with bare root having the least amount of success. Disadvantages, again, these are super heavy, so you're going to need machinery to move these around, both to get them to the site, then even once you're on site. They're going to be the most expensive, so if you have a limited budget for planting trees, it's not going to go very far. Definitely not volunteer friendly, and you still can't see the roots in these trees, so there could be issues going on below in that root ball that you would have to really go in and do some excavation to find out. So a bit more here on encircling and then girdling roots. So I mentioned how this happens, where it grows and hits the side of the pot. The big issues with encircling roots is that if we don't have good root exploration into the surrounding soil, we're going to have a tree that has an ever demanding need for water and nutrients as that top grows and produces more photosynthetic material. And now our roots aren't, we're just collecting the water in a very limited space. That's going to lead to stress and decline of that tree. And secondly, it's sort of a structural thing. If you just have this encircled root mass, it's not really stabilizing and can then tip over. So one way we could deal with this is just from the beginning, using different container types. Here pictured is the grow bag. So there's a number of different products out in the trade that utilize this type of format. It's just like a fabric bag, so that when the roots grow out and the root tips hit that bag, they get entangled, and it helps prevent them from encircling around in the container. The second type, which I mentioned in the previous photo, is the air root pruning pot. So these have perforations in the plastic that then provide a spot where if the root tip hits it, that root tip hits the pure air and then will die back, and can also help prevent encircling roots. But in a lot of cases, you're the last user of this, and so you might get an encircled root system. So what can you do if you do get one of these? And what you can utilize is what we call the boxing method. And this is just taking that encircled root system and slicing it down on the side, breaking through those encircling roots. Here's just another illustration of it. So you create this box or cube. Oftentimes, folks will also do a cut along the bottom. And then in just after a few weeks, you're going to have a lot of nice fine root proliferation coming out from those cut ends and finding their way into the soil. It can seem a little bit drastic, but it is still quite safe for the trees at this stage, and really can be beneficial. Another issue that arises in the long term are stem girdling roots. So stem girdling roots form primarily due to poor planting practices in regards to the depth. So if a tree is planted too deeply, those roots can grow up towards the surface, and they could start growing back on themselves and then end up growing right up along the stem. And then those roots and stem tissue are now competing for that same spot. They can't fuse together. And this is going to result in a point of compression, which is going to lead to an increased pressure gradient that will require more pressure to get water from the roots up into the canopy, which will then stress the photosynthesis system. And then secondly, it can provide this point of future failure. So oftentimes you'll see these large trees just popping out of the ground where that encircling root was. So to prevent this, it's just a matter of making sure we take a couple minutes to plant the tree at the right depth. And here's just an image showing you can use something like a surveyor's arrow or something that's sharp to find the first main order or first lateral kind of main structural root that's coming out of the tree. Here's just an example of one that was severely overplanted in this case, a balled and burlap tree, right? So had to do some digging just to get this down to the right depth. And once we do have that first main order root, we want to be planting that within the top inch at least, or right at the soil surface. Here's showing another example of correcting something that was planted too deep in a container, where they had to remove something like 3 to 4 inches of soil. Oftentimes, this area that's growing above the first main order root, and you need to be removing it, can be very colonized by roots and can be actually quite difficult to remove. So going in with a saw or something to ease that process carefully, of course, but if you kind of have a sense of where that root is, you can utilize something like a saw. Other things now, once you're getting the tree in the ground at the time of planting, is a good time to take off any strings, twines, wraps. These maybe are thought to photodegrade over time and or potentially providing some sort of structural stability, but this is just setting the tree up for some sort of future damage. You can see it girdling this young stem, which are going to be expanding quite rapidly relative to their current size. So just move them, take them off. So planting depth, planting hole, how big should you dig your hole? Well, again, we're wanting to plant at the proper depth, so no need to go any deeper than the height of the root ball. Here on the right is a bare root tree, and so sometimes those holes can actually be quite shallow. In terms of width, if we're just talking about a general, good practice would be something like digging the hole 2 or 3 times as wide as the root ball. So we're turning up that soil and providing a nice aerated soil for those roots to explore out and start growing out into. Watering, of course, so at the time of planting, really doing a good job to soak and use the water to fill in any air gaps. Just using something like a 5-gallon bucket to really saturate that soil. And then moving forward, thinking about watering in terms of a dose and frequency. So here we're just showing best practice would be something like 2 gallons per caliper inch. So a caliper inch is 6 inches above that first main order root, 2 to 3 times a week during the growing season. And then also have to use a bit of intuition here because you wouldn't want to be watering a saturated soil. There's lots of different watering devices, just showing here a grow bag, but we're at a little after 6:50, so I think I'm just going to keep moving here. Mentioned understanding what kind of soil you have. You can use a percolation test. So this is digging a column, for example, a 2-foot column into your yard, filling it with water, and then filling it again. And what we're looking for is how fast is that column of water draining. And if it's taking more than 24 hours to drain that column of water, it just something to be aware of, that you're going to have a fairly saturated soil or potentially compacted soil. But a soil that can drain a 24-inch column of water within about 24 hours or an inch per hour is a satisfactorily drained soil. Staking, we generally say only stake unstable trees and only stake as necessary, making sure to use these wide attachments here to the stake. This is a stake that's just on the windward side, and we're not really wrenching this down unless you need to for some reason, but you really want the tree to sort of have its ability to react to its surroundings, prevailing winds, and then the strap is really just there to grab it if it's gonna, tip over. Where to place these, a good starting spot would be something like 2/3 the distance from the ground to the first branch. Mulching, there's lots of benefits to mulch, and it can help retain moisture, protects from mechanical damage, help buffer those soil temperatures. A couple things to think about when installing these. There's the 3-3-3 method, which is just an easy way to remember. You want 3 feet wide. Some people will say bigger is better, but 3 feet wide, about 3 inches deep, and then at least 3 inches or more away from the main stem. So no mulch volcanoes. If we're piling mulch up against that stem, we're just creating future soil, and we just took all this effort to plant at the right depth. Now we don't want that mulch to ruin that. So stem protection, here we've got, I don't know how you protect against this guy, but we also have damage from things like mowers and string whips or weed whips. And then also during the winter, lots of hungry rabbits and voles. So one thing I'll point out here is that young stems do photosynthesize. So guards that are installed during a growing season and then allow light to pass through would be best. Something like a corrugated plastic protector certainly fine for winter protection, but I would suggest taking that off when it comes time for the growing season to be here, and so that you can allow the light to hit any photosynthetic cells in that stem. So we do have a lot of this information in different formats. For example, here on our YouTube page, we've got a whole series on best planting practices from Professor Emeritus Gary Johnson. So you can find us there. We also got an Instagram, and we'll have fun facts or just nice photos. So if you're into social media, into YouTube, you can find us there. So with that, we've got about 5 minutes or so for questions. Monica, are you watching the chat?
I am. A few questions have come in and have been answered in the chat. So if anyone has more, they can unmute and ask or throw them in the chat and I'll read them aloud.
I was seeing the chat light up, and so I was like, oh, there's a lot of questions to get to.
Well, here, while we wait, if anyone else is typing, maybe Dan there was a question earlier, when Dan was talking about the benefits of having slow growing trees planted. Maybe you could add a little bit of elaboration to that. Dustin responded with, they tend to have a much longer lifespan and they'll also be more structurally sound, but do you have other recommendations as to why a slow growing tree might be the right choice?
Yeah, and I think my perspective is coming from being a production arborist for the first half of my career, and fast growing trees tend to need more pruning maintenance, just because they're growing faster next to a building, let's say, or a driveway, or the tree happens to have poorly attached limbs, meaning it has poor structure, so that there are more pruning needs that need to be done in order to prevent structural damage or, storm damage or trees falling apart. So I think that's like my main perspective on that. You'd need less maintenance, less return visits to deal with pruning maintenance and structural issues. And then Dustin, I think I mentioned, and Dustin, I just want to elaborate on the fact that slower growing trees tend to have longer lifespans. So if you have a tree planted in your yard and, 30 years later, if it was a really short-lived tree, it may be larger than a slow growing tree, but you're going to have to remove that tree because it's either declining or it's outgrown its space, and then you have to start over. Whereas the slower growing tree is still within its bounds and providing ecosystem services the whole time, instead of this interruption where you have to get rid of a tree and plant a new one. So it's like money saving and just more, I think, environmentally sound, to be planting a slower growing tree. I know that folks want to see a tree grow fast, but think in tree time.
Want to see them grow long.
Humans are different than trees, so let's not project our lifespan time to trees.
We have one more quick question just before we're done. A bare pear tree was recently delivered to me that appeared to have several large roots cut. Is this typical, and will that tree live?
So the tree has had some roots removed.
Did it say it was a bare root tree?
Yeah, bare root pear tree is what the question said. Was this Grace?
Hi, yeah, I can show a picture of it if that helps.
Oh, we have to move a window.
I'm sorry. Is that
And this is part of the process of bare rooting trees, and so it's very common for sure to see a bare rooted tree have lots of root severance happening. What they'll do is they kind of get lifted out of the ground, and then the nursery will spend all winter actually just like going through each, and they'll do root pruning in the coolers as well. So this is one of the reasons why, being aware of it and knowing that you want to make sure you do your best to put water properly through the growing season to give it its best chance. But I would say this is sort of kind of standard.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for giving me hope.
Yeah, Dan, Ryan, thank you so much. It is 7, so people have places to be in a sunny Thursday evening to admire dimming, then that is the time we have. But thank you again, Dan and Ryan. I can stick around for a couple more minutes if folks have other questions. Just a reminder, there will be a survey sent out, a post-session survey, and then to a list of recommended tree species. Hope to see some of you or all of you at our next learning series in Falwell Park on June 20th. Thank you, Dan and Ryan, again.
Of course. You're very welcome. Thanks for having us.